All right, good evening and welcome. We're continuing our hermeneutics study where we're going through and looking at the various types of literature in the Bible. We've been moving through the Old Testament and the various types of literature in the Old Testament, and this is going to be the final session in the Old Testament study. And then next time we will start looking at New Testament literature. So we've gone through, we've looked at narrative, we've looked at law, we've looked at poetry, we've looked at prophecy. And now we're looking particularly at wisdom literature. Now, wisdom literature has a lot of overlap with poetry because the wisdom books are also books of poetry, but they're also distinct because they are books that are intent on encouraging the readers to find God's wisdom, to seek God's wisdom, to live according to God's wisdom. And that is a really important point for Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, but it's not the point of Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. It's not the point of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel. Okay, so it's kind of its own little setting. So there's going to be a lot of overlap here with looking at books of poetry, but the textbook that we've been looking at, I keep calling it a textbook, but I know you guys aren't thinking of it as a textbook. The book that we're using uh, puts this in its own section as wisdom literature, so I think it's a good idea to look at it from that perspective. So again, we're going to be looking particularly at how we should be reading and interpreting Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, which I think in some sense these are very accessible books to people. People tend to be able to jump into Proverbs and say, okay, I can make sense of this. This is really good. But I think actually having an understanding as to what sort of literature it is trying to be for its readers will help us to get the most out of that. And not just that, but also Job and Ecclesiastes. Okay, so let's begin. Let's just kind of talk a little bit about the basics of wisdom literature. So, generally, the wisdom books of the Old Testament are regarded as Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. You might think that there are a couple of Psalms that are included in this list, but for the most part, wisdom books are those three, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Wisdom literature explores real, genuine human experiences, whether it's the success or the failure, the joy or the sorrow, and the sufferings of life. And of course, our attempt at actually making sense of them. So it's dealing with life and trying to wisely understand why things sometimes go good and things sometimes don't go as planned. We'll also find that there's a common phrase that appears in wisdom literature that's the fear of the Lord or the fear of Yahweh. It's actually described as the beginning of wisdom or the foundation of wisdom. There's an argument that actually could be made that in Job 1:7 that the word means that it's kind of the goal of wisdom. The fear of Yahweh is the goal, kind of the end point of wisdom. But this particular phrase appears in Job, in Proverbs, and in Ecclesiastes, in very important places, by the way. So wisdom literature heavily emphasizes creation and moral reflection of how human beings are to live in God's creation rightly. Okay, and so this moral and ethical reflection on creation often leads to different experiences. And so Psalms and Proverbs will look at the creation that God has wisely ordered, and it will look at the wise ways in which we are supposed to be living, and they will view this in a positive light. But Job and Ecclesiastes will look at this in somewhat a pessimistic light. And so the Bible doesn't try to hide the fact that there are difficult questions and people do actually experience suffering and wrongdoing in this world. And the biblical writers don't try to say, well, let's just leave out Job and Ecclesiastes because they don't have a positive spin on this particular topic. It actually says let's keep all of these voices together so that we have a good, well-rounded explanation of these things. So when you look at the reflection on wisdom, namely, how did God wisely order this world? How do we respond morally as wise human beings? Psalms and Proverbs are going to spin that in a positive way. to where Job and Ecclesiastes are going to spin it in a pessimistic way. And I think the best way to do is to not grab onto one of those books and ignore the others. Like, don't jump onto Proverbs and ignore Job and Ecclesiastes. On the other hand, you probably shouldn't look at the pessimism of Ecclesiastes and ignore Psalms and Proverbs. If the canon has all of these voices in it, we should be able to listen to all of those. I think that's just a good, mature way of looking at things. So let's begin by looking at Job. I'm just going in the order in which we have them in the Bible, not necessarily in the order in which they were written, which is actually a much more complex topic. Okay, so Job. Job is actually going to begin its book, 42 chapters, and it's going to end with a narrative framework. Okay, so the first two chapters have narrative, and the final 42nd chapter also is narrative. And then everything else in the middle of it is going to be straight poetry. And it's some of the most difficult poetry to translate. It's some of the most difficult Hebrew in the Old Testament. It's not the kind of stuff that you give to beginning Hebrew readers. The narrative sections are pretty straightforward, but it's a book that basically says, 90% of it is going to be, it's going to be uh, poetry, but the initial parts are going to be narrative. And there's going to be lots and lots of long speeches that are called disputations. That's really important. Okay. Job is full of disputations. What is a disputation? It's a speech, but it's a particular speech in which the author, that's the author of Job, or the speaker in the speech is going to try to persuade the reader of his or her point of view. Okay. That doesn't mean that you're supposed to be persuaded by that point of view. It just means that it's going to give a speech where they're trying to get you to see this. Okay. So Job's friends are going to try to persuade Job that, well, you must have really done something wrong in order for all these bad things to happen to you. That's what they're trying to persuade him with their speech. But as the reader who has access to the first two chapters, that Job was basically innocent. He was blameless. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. So these speeches have to be interpreted in light of the overall context of Job because not every perspective offered is correct, nor is every perspective endorsed by the author of Job. And that's a really important point. It's what makes reading Job a little bit difficult because you can't just jump into a particular chapter and you say, well, it sounds like he's trying to say this. I better believe what they're saying. Because there are often times to where uh, Job is going to give his own disputations and refute the disputations of his friends. Okay, so you can't just sit there and say, well, the Bible says this, because in the very next chapter, the Bible might actually refute what was just said in the previous chapter. So that's the difficulty of Job, is that you really have to kind of read it all in one setting in order to get that sense. So this is where I actually find, like in my Bible, I find it's really important to keep in mind who actually is doing the talking. So here I actually have an interesting little set of bullet points that indicates who is doing the talking in all of these speeches. So remember, chapters 1 through 2 is going to be narrative. Chapter 42 is going to be narrative, but also that's one of those speeches of God. So Job, he's going to give his speech. You can see he's going to give his speech in chapter 3. And then his first friend, Eliphaz, is going to give a speech in chapters 4 through 5. Job's going to respond to that in 6 through 7. And then his next friend, Bildad, is going to speak in chapter 8. Job will respond in chapters 9 through 10. And then the third friend, Zophar, is going to speak in chapter 11. Job's going to respond in chapters 12 through 14. And then the three friends go again. Eliphaz, back to Job. Bildad, back to Job. Zophar, back to Job. Okay? And then we get this interesting fourth friend that shows up, Elihu. Okay? And he gives a long, long speech, chapters 32 through 37. And then God gets the final word with the final 5 chapters. Okay? So I think it's helpful to kind of see it from the big picture. But this is one of the books that it's really difficult if all you do is you want to read a couple verses or you want to read a couple of chapters. The best thing to do is just really give yourself an hour or an hour and 15 minutes so you can read it all in one setting. And I think you'll get the most out of it that way. If not, just make sure you take some good notes in your Bible to know who actually is talking. Okay. So, what are some good keys, tips, and principles for interpreting Job? Number one, knowing that disputation speeches dominate the book of Job, it's important to keep in mind who is giving the speech and what truths are being presented within it. Okay? So, if God is giving a speech in Job, you know that all those truths are actually true. Okay? Job could be giving a disputation and he is telling the truth from the perspective that he knows, but it's very clear that Job doesn't know everything that took place in the first two chapters. God knows, the reader knows, but Job doesn't know this. So he's telling truth, but he's only telling the truth from the little bit that he knows at that point. Um, and his friends are telling what they think to be true, but we actually learn that that's not actually true from the perspective of God. Number two, since the narrative portrays Job as a hero of the story, who is even vindicated at the conclusion, we have to take Job's claim to innocence seriously. And this is one of the interesting things about Job, is that Job is an innocent person who suffers, and God seems to allow this suffering. And you've got this Satan figure, who I think for the very first time in the Bible is actually described as an angel, as one of the heavenly angelic sons of God. And his job is to go and kind of play the prosecuting attorney, to kind of say, God, this is why he's bad. This is why he's going to turn from you. This is why he's evil. And this is, you kind of get the first. I actually think that the first appearance, unambiguous appearance of Satan, at least explicitly mentioned there. Actually, we'll describe him as the Satan, the accuser, the adversary, in this particular passage. Okay. But a lot of readers have said, okay, what is Job supposed to represent? Is he representing the average person who suffers? Is he representing the average Israelite who suffers? Is it being read in light of the Babylonian exile, to where the Israelites suffered, uh, captivity and the destruction of the temple, and the removal of the people from the land? Well, the Israelites were hardly innocent in that. I think the books of Kings and Chronicles make that very, very clear. The prophets make that very clear. They weren't innocent. So, where Job fits into all this is an interesting question. It's not quite as clear, and I think that's what makes the book kind of interesting, because it allows us to have some conversations. Okay, Job's claim to innocence, number three, is based on his perspective of the creation around him, being wholly unaware of what took place in chapters 1 through 2 in heaven. So God's speeches at the end, remember God's speeches, or the final five chapters, if I'm not mistaken, they seek to educate Job on the limits of his perspective, which I think might actually be one of the good application points, is that we try to understand our own experience of suffering and we don't even know what's going on. God knows everything, and maybe part of our suffering is acknowledging that I don't understand what all is taking place, but I need to continue to maintain my trust and my faithfulness in God and Christ. Number four, Job is not an Israelite. That's a really important point. Nor is he a recipient of the Torah. He doesn't live in the land of Israel. Job lives in the land of Uz. Now, you can go to the back of your Bible and you can look on those maps, and you will not find Uz anywhere in Israel. Okay. So despite Job being placed in the Old Testament, he should not be interpreted within Jewish categories. That's the interesting thing, is that the author, who clearly is Jewish, writing in Hebrew, is portraying a non-Jewish person who doesn't know anything about the laws of Moses, and is not, in his description of being blameless, he's not blameless because, well, he was circumcised, he obeyed the Ten Commandments, he didn't worship idols, he kept all the sacrifices. He's blameless, just kind of in a general sense of just being a good person who's not sinful. Okay, which again I think makes the application of this all the more interesting. It's not very straightforward. So therefore, it's prudent to understand Job as an attempt to understand the justice of God. We might call that the doctrine of theodicy, as it pertains to some, but not all instances of human suffering. Sometimes I suffer because I made poor choices. Okay. I could tell you stories in my past to where bad things happen to me because of poor decision making. That's my fault. Okay. That's not Satan, doing something to me. Okay. But sometimes bad things happen and I don't know why that happened. I think that I did the right thing and I can't understand why that is. So I don't think Job has a universal application. I think it tries to give an answer, and somewhat an incomplete answer, to human suffering when bad things happen to good people. So, again, I think by kind of having those as some general guidelines, we could probably go into Job and make the most out of the book as we attempt to read it for ourselves. So let me give you a particular passage in Job that I think is really, really interesting, and it shows a little bit of the poetry and some of the discussion of the fear of Yahweh. Okay, so this is Job chapter 28, which in some sense is kind of unique to Job. It's the only quote unquote wisdom passage in Job. And I want to read all of it. I want to read all 28 verses. But the first part of it really sets up the wisdom part in the second half. Okay. And so I want you to kind of get a sense as to what the author here is trying to look for. That's the best way I can kind of say it. Okay. If you know the passage, you know where I'm actually going with this, but you haven't read this in a while, allow yourself to be intrigued by what the passage is unfolding to say. All right. Surely there is a mine for silver, a place where they refine gold. Iron is taken from the dust, and copper is smelt from rock. Man puts an end to darkness, and in the farthest limit, he searches out the rock in gloom and deep shadow. He sinks a shaft far from habitation, forgotten by the foot. They hang and swing to and fro far from men. The earth, from it comes food, and underneath it is turned up as fire. Its rocks are the source of sapphires, and its dust contains gold. The path no bird of prey knows, nor has the falcon's eye caught sight of it. The proud beast has not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over it. He puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountains at the base. He hews out channels through the rocks, and his eyes see anything precious. He dams up the stream from flowing, and what is hidden he brings out to light. Okay. Human beings are looking for things that are important. They're looking for things that are valuable. They are looking for gold, silver, sapphires, precious stones. They're looking for these things. That's what they're looking for. And they are digging and they are digging and they are digging, but it's like they're seeking for what is valuable. Okay, and then look at how the passage goes. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. I should probably also say here, too, that the pronouns for wisdom are actually feminine. And so there's an argument that some people have made, and I think it's really persuasive, that whenever it says man does not know its value, it probably should be man does not know her value. Okay, so just kind of keep it, think about that in your mind if people are looking for wisdom. Okay. The deep says, this is the personification of the deep waters, it is not in me, as in wisdom, she is not in me. And the sea, personified sea, says, it is not with me. Pure gold cannot be given in exchange for it, nor can silver be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold or glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for articles of fine gold. Coral and crystal are not to be mentioned, and the acquisition of wisdom is above that of pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from, and where is the place of understanding? Thus it is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the sky. Abaddon and death. Those are just synonyms for death, by the way. They are personified and they say, with our ears we have heard of it. We've heard of wisdom. God understands her way, or God understands its way, and he knows her place, its place. For he looks to the ends of the earth and he sees everything under the heavens. When he imparted weight to the wind and meted out the waters by measure, when he set a limit for the rain and a course for the thunderbolt, and he saw it, he saw wisdom, and declared it, he declared wisdom. He established it and searched it out. And to man, he said, here's the conclusion. Here's the conclusion of everything that we've just said. Man is looking for precious stones. He's also looking for wisdom, and wisdom is far more valuable than all these precious stones. Here's the conclusion. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. It's a really beautiful passage. I mean, just, think someone 2,500 years ago wrote this whole thing. And it indicates that wise living that people are looking for throughout creation. They're looking through God's good creation, and it indicates that it's hidden. Yahweh's the only one who knows where it is, but if you want it, you got to fear God and you have to depart from evil. Okay, so it's found by living rightly with God. An interesting passage there in Job. Okay. All right. So let's move on from Job and let's move to Proverbs. The interesting thing with Proverbs is that, and this is something that I didn't know until I started reading it carefully, is that the opening line in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1 says the Proverbs of Solomon. And we tend to think that's just kind of the opening line for the entirety of the book. But the rest of the book of Proverbs will have various sections. Will say, the Proverbs of Hezekiah or the Proverbs of this particular king. So Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1 is just the introduction of a particular section. I think it's chapters 1 through 9. And there are various other sections. So Proverbs is a collection of Proverbs from different times, at least as old as Solomon, but it probably wasn't even collected and put into its final form until sometime in what is called the Persian period, which is about the 5th century. So lots and lots of time has gone into it, but it wasn't, despite what the first verse says, it wasn't written by Solomon because it indicates later the Proverbs that that Hezekiah had. So clearly it had to be at the time of Hezekiah, if not later. So that's just kind of an opening point where we're thinking about the dating of Proverbs. It's not as straightforward as we might think. Okay, what is a proverb? Okay, proverb is a concise, memorable statement of truth that is learned over extended human experience. Okay, these proverbs are things that people that, if they know a lot about life, if they have some experience in the world, they can just kind of gather these as things that they learn from human experience. Okay, they're not even necessarily God's truths. Some of them are, okay, but others are proverbs that could be shared in other cultures. Okay, so these proverbs, they are what this is one of the most important things. They are what are called probable truths. They are not absolute truths. So proverbs are going to point out patterns of conduct that, if followed, will give the user the best chance of success. In other words, they are not guaranteed promises of God. Okay, and that's difficult for some readers because they think, well, if I just do this, then, and it's in the Bible, God's going to do this for me. But you think, train up a child in the way that he's going to go, and he's not going to depart from it when he turns into an adult. That doesn't always turn out that way. There are many people that have raised their kids in church, and when they turn out to adults, they leave the church. Parents have done what they're supposed to. Okay. But the point is that they are probable truths. Like, as if you follow them, there's a high chance of success that's going to bring about the result that it says. Okay. So that's a really, really key important point that I thought we can't talk about Proverbs until we state that first. Okay. So here's an example. In all labor, there is profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. Okay. That's a good general probable truth that, you know what? If you work hard, you're going to profit. Okay. That's not always true. There are some people that work really hard and they don't profit. But for the most part, I think the proverb is trying to say you should be a hard worker. You should be a diligent worker. And if you do so, you're going to be able to have a good job. Okay. But if all you're going to do is talk and you're not going to work hard, then it's going to lead to poverty. Okay. And again, that's not always true. Okay. There's some people that find themselves the heirs of an inheritance and they didn't work hard at all, or they win the lottery, or they just stumble upon some money and they didn't work very hard. And the people that work really hard get upset at that. Okay. But it's a general truth. It's a probable truth. Okay. Proverbs are also situational truths. Okay. And so there needs to be some discernment on when to use them. Okay. Not every proverb works in every single circumstance. There are some proverbs that say, when you're in the presence of a king, this is how you're supposed to act. Okay. I don't think that that's the way that you're supposed to act when you are at line at Burger King. You know, there are certain proverbs that they're intended for particular circumstances, contextual circumstances, but they're not meant to be, again, universal truths. So we have to, again, Proverbs are accessible and they're easy for people to jump into, but they require a lot of wisdom and discernment in order to use them correctly. Okay, so here's one of my favorite examples of this. Okay, so don't answer a fool according to his folly, or you will also be like him. Okay, that's in Proverbs 26, verse 4. The very next verse, Proverbs 26, verse 5, says this: Answer a fool as his folly deserves, that he will not be wise in his own eyes. Okay, so you just told me that I'm not supposed to answer a fool according to his folly. And then the very next line, you said that I should answer a fool as he deserves, as his folly deserves. Well, that's just because sometimes you're not supposed to respond to people when they're acting that way, or you're going to become like them. Sometimes you need to show someone how ridiculous they are so that you can teach that person a little bit of humility and you could teach them a lesson. Okay. How do you know which one is right? Well, you have to learn the discernment to know when to use Proverbs at certain times. Okay. But the fact that the author was willing to put both of those lines, which at face value seem like they clearly contradict each other, right next to each other, one after another, indicates that they're not meant to be universal truths. They are situational truths that are probable. If you use them at the right situation, you have a high probability of bringing about the results. It's a really important point. Okay. So, Proverbs, of course, is going to encourage us to live according to God's wisdom, the wise ways that God wants us to live. The first 9 chapters, of course, make this very, very clear that the instructions of God are wise. And so the people who are called the wise ones, the wise people, the wise guys, not in a derogatory way, they are the people that have taken the wise instructions of God and they've implemented them with discernment in the right places. That's what makes someone wise. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some of the principles, the strategies, and the tips for interpreting Proverbs. Number one, we need to note that there are various forms of parallelism in the individual Proverbs. Some of these uh, Proverbs are put in what we would call synonymous parallelism. Synonymous parallelism is when you have two lines that they self-interpret. One line will be described with the same topic and same theme as the second line. So here you can see here in chapter 19, verse 5, a false witness will not go unpunished. And here's the second line, he who breathes out lies will not escape. So you can see a false witness is further defined as one who breathes out lies, and not going unpunished means that the person will not escape. So they're not saying two things in here. They're giving two lines that say the same thing, but it says it in two ways in order to make sure that you understand the particular point. The second line is set in parallel, synonymous parallelism with the first line. So that's really important. Okay. There's also what is called contrasting parallelism, which is often called antithetical parallelism. This is the opposite of synonymous parallelism. It's to where you got one line, and the second line is going to be the opposite of the first line. And you use this to kind of contrast. So here's an example. Chapter 2, verses 21 through 22. The upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. Okay. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous shall be uprooted from it. Okay. So clearly, you got what's the opposite of the upright? That's the wicked. Okay. So you have the promise that either you're going to live in the land or you're going to be cut off from the land. I mean, that's basically Christianity, right? You're either going to inherit the kingdom or you're going to be cut off. Okay. And you're going to inherit it and you're going to live in it. You're going to remain in it. Okay. Or you're going to be cut off and you're going to be uprooted from it. So you can see there the two lines are set in, they are parallel, but they're not synonymous. They're antithetical. They're contrasting. So usually, uh, it's easy to see the sort of parallelism that's there, but we just need to recognize that there's going to be a lot, and I mean a lot of parallelism in Proverbs. Number three, individual Proverbs express truth that works in most cases because these conclusions are drawn from observing creation and human experience. So many of the Proverbs are just things that you could just pick up through the experience of living life. And they're things that you would want to pass on to, of course, younger readers, younger people, which is why they make young people, youth groups, kids read Proverbs because they've got some good, wise teachings in it. That's important, okay? But the interesting thing is that these aren't these sort of, thus saith the Lord, God is telling you these things. These are, a lot of these truths are things that you could just pick up in life. The things that, they're not even necessarily God's truths. They're things that even, an atheist would say, yeah, that's just generally good advice that I should have with my life. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. So I also think that we need to take seriously the poetic devices that pervade Proverbs, okay? Like metaphor, we've talked about parallelism, and of course, personification, okay? I mean, I feel like it probably just because of all the work that I do on wisdom Christology, like every single day, somebody asks me a question about how to understand wisdom in Proverbs or how to understand Jesus in terms of wisdom. And I keep saying wisdom is a personification. It's very easy to see. So here is the first time that wisdom, which earlier in the book, we'll look at this, is described as God's wise instructions, God's wise teachings. But later in the chapter, in chapter 1, wisdom becomes personified as a female prophet. We would call it a prophetess. And so what does she do? Well, wisdom shouts in the streets. She lifts up her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates of the city, she utters her sayings. Those are four different synonymous parallel lines. Shouting, lifting her voice, crying out, utters her sayings. Where? In the streets, in the squares, in the noisy streets, at the entrance of the gates. Okay, so here you have wisdom yelling and making public what she wants to say, not in private places, but in public places. So, and you can also look at this and say, okay, this is giving us an interesting look at wisdom that's slightly different than what we saw in Job. Because remember, Job is that people can't find wisdom. Only God knows where it is. But here, wisdom seems to be very, very public. But later in her speech, she's going to say that if you reject her, she's going to run away from you. She'll become inaccessible if you don't want to listen to what God has to say. So it's like she's initially accessible, but then she becomes inaccessible if you refuse to listen. To where Job says she's kind of inaccessible. If you want to find her, you've got to find the fear of Yahweh first. All right, so let's look at how this plays out in Job. So again, these are the opening lines, and what I did was I took the verses and I took all the parallel parts and I just kind of broke them into different lines, so you can kind of see how this works. And understanding how parallelism works, you'll be able to see what the author is trying to say. Okay, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding. Those are meant to be parallel. Wisdom and instruction and the sayings of understanding, those are all meant to be the same thing. Knowing is the same thing as discerning. To receive instruction in wise behavior. Okay, so of course, if you know wisdom and instruction, you're going to be behaving wisely. Righteousness, justice, and equity. That, of course, is further defining the wise behavior. To give prudence to the naive. That's like, teaching wisdom to the naive. To the youth, teaching knowledge and discretion. Same thing as teaching prudence. A wise man is going to hear and increase in learning. The man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. So you can see those are parallel lines. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. Okay. So a proverb, a figure, wise words, and riddles. You can see how the parallelism works there. Okay. But clearly, right there, the first occurrence of wisdom is not a conscious female person alongside Yahweh. And wisdom's not even personified at this earliest stage. Wisdom is just God's instruction, it's God's sayings that lead to understanding. They are his instructions that lead to wise behavior. I mean, that's what it is. And so it's God's wise teachings to his people. And then, of course, wisdom gets personified, and she's saying, listen to my wise teachings. That's how it works. But at the beginning, it's clearly not personified. So we understand the personification based on the plain, simple, straightforward passages that open up the book. And then you could jump to chapter 3, and you could see again how wisdom is again set in parallelism. But we can also see something interesting. We see an argument that wisdom is so important that Yahweh himself used wisdom. And then, because Yahweh used wisdom, you should use wisdom yourself. So in chapter 3, verse 19, Yahweh by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding, he established the heavens. By his knowledge, the deeps were broken up and the skies drip with dew. Okay. So God created all things with his wisdom, which is further defined as his understanding and his knowledge. Okay. So his wisdom is just his wise understanding, his knowledge, his wise understanding. And that's how he created all things. So wisdom is so important that Yahweh used it. So, passage goes on, my son, let them not vanish from your sight. What is the them? Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Don't let them vanish from your sight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. Why? So they'll be life for your soul and adornment to your neck. Then you will walk in your way securely and your foot will not stumble. Okay, so the point there is that you should be using wisdom and understanding and knowledge because God himself used wisdom, understanding, and knowledge to create the world. You can see, this is why I talked about how wisdom is something that is seen and experienced in creation because God has wisely ordered creation, but also it is bound up in the moral way that we are supposed to be living our lives by living wisely, by living according to God's wise commandments. And Proverbs really just puts all this together. So hopefully that's easy for you to see. And I'm trying to give you passages here that you can take and you can show your friends and you can walk them through the steps of how all this works because I don't think it's that difficult, but I'm a little biased. I mean, I've been working this material for 20 years, so it doesn't seem that difficult to me. But I think these are passages that I think adults can latch onto and they can say, yeah, I can follow this, I can make sense of it, and I can see the steps of progression, and I think I can help other people to see it as well. Hopefully that's the case with you. Okay. Oh gosh, we're getting to 40 minutes. Okay, we haven't even started Ecclesiastes yet. All right, that's okay. That's fine. I think this is all good stuff, so I'm not apologizing about it. Okay. All right, so we've done Job, done Proverbs, now we're going to Ecclesiastes. Okay. So Ecclesiastes, which is originally named Kohelet, which actually is just the word for preacher. Okay. And it actually offers a biographical reflection of life from the perspective of Solomon. Okay. You'll notice, by the way, that I didn't say that it's an autobiographical reflection. This is somebody telling us the reflection from the perspective of Solomon as the author would want you to understand. Okay. So this is not Solomon himself writing this. This is somebody telling us what they think Solomon would have reflected on their own life. Okay. I don't think any modern scholar today thinks that actually Solomon in the 10th century wrote this book. It's a biography of what Solomon would have thought. So, um, because I mean, it's actually called The Preacher. It's the sort of thing that he would have preached. Okay, so by reflecting on life, creation, and human experience, Ecclesiastes offers another view into Jewish wisdom literature. So we've already seen in Proverbs that if you take God's wisdom, things are going to be good. You're going to be able to follow the straight path. It's going to be good for you. You're going to find life, and you're going to find that things are going to go well for you. Ecclesiastes is going to give, a little bit more of a pessimistic view of things. Some people say that it's not being pessimistic; they're just being honest. They're being uh, kind of blunt about the difficulties of life. So it just kind of depends on your own perspective on it. Okay, so several sections of Ecclesiastes actually have three components, and so this might actually help you to um, break down the arrangement of some of the passages in Ecclesiastes. So they'll start with this, kind of putting the words into Solomon's mouth. I have seen, or I looked again, or I passed by, kind of just jumping in and saying, this is my reflection on something. The second part is going to be a quotation of Proverbs, some sort of rhetorical question, or some sort of life story, and then a conclusion with the moral summary. So that's kind of how a lot of the passages are going to go. There's like a dozen of these in Ecclesiastes that kind of work as formal sections. The difficulty, though, is that they're not broken up into chapters. So you have to kind of know that this is the way that it kind of arranges its sections. It'd be nice if they were put into paragraphs, but I think this is a good way to kind of help you to read along and to make sense of what's actually taking place. So here's an example in chapter 1, and you'll see how it works. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. So he kind of says, look, I started off, I've seen all this sort of stuff there. And he gives a particular proverb or some sort of life story, and then he gives a conclusion, and the conclusion seems a little bit pessimistic there. There's an interesting point there that where he says, I've gotten more wisdom than all of those who were over Jerusalem before me. But if you think, how many people were actually over Jerusalem prior to Solomon? Well, you've got David. That's true. But who was before David? That was King Saul. But King Saul wasn't actually over Jerusalem. Okay, it was David who actually moved to Jerusalem. So the fact that he describes all who were over Jerusalem before me indicates multiple persons, which suggests that this is referring to all the kings that were over Jerusalem from the perspective of this particular author. It's difficult to kind of read that and say that's exactly what Solomon would have said because the all implies more than one, when in reality, that there really should only be one, being David. So that's just kind of one of the clues that scholars look at and say, yeah, this is someone who is telling the wisdom that they think Solomon would have said, but they're looking at the wisdom of all those people that were in Jerusalem. So I'm not going to make a big deal out of that, but just you can check the commentaries or your study Bibles for more information on that. Okay, so what are some of the principles for interpreting Ecclesiastes? Some of the tips and strategies that we can use to make sense of this somewhat pessimistic book. Okay, number one, since Ecclesiastes is a collection of reflections on life that end with a moral conclusion, it is important to interpret each section in light of the way in which the author brings it to a close with its own practical advice. Okay. So remember, it's going to start off by saying, this is what I've observed, or I've thought about this, and it's going to give a particular parable, and then he's going to give a conclusion. It doesn't do us any good to read just a little part of it without reading its own conclusion. It's like you have to read the conclusion of a parable to make sense of the parable. So the same thing here is that you have to read the conclusion, the way the author brings that section and that reflection to a close in order to make sense of its contents. You can't just grab a couple of verses and pull them out of context. That's just generally a bad idea. But hopefully, if you've made it this far into this particular series on hermeneutics, you know the dangers of just grabbing a couple verses out of context. Okay, number two. In light of this, the entire book, which is often seen as overly pessimistic in its outlook on life's experiences and perspective on creation, concludes with a noteworthy moral application. Okay, so we could look at the conclusion given to the entire book, which is Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 through 14. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God, keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. Why? Why should we do this? For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So the point is, you should, the interesting thing here is that I think the final moral application is not pessimistic, unless you're just a bad person. The point is that, hey, fear God, okay? Because God is going to one day have a day of judgment. He's going to deal with everything, whether good or evil. And I think that's going to fix all things. You might think that the world right now is bad or evil, going in the wrong direction, but there's going to be a day of judgment, and God's going to take care of things on that day. Okay? So I thought that was kind of an interesting way of looking at the conclusion of the entire book. The way that a story ends or the way that a movie ends, of course, is very important to the story. So the way that this book ends, I think, helps to kind of put it in a positive light for looking at the entire purpose of the book. Number three, the perspectives in Ecclesiastes should challenge us to be honest about the difficulties of life in a broken world that is in need of redemption. We should be honest. We should be real about it. And we should resist the urge to ignore the contribution of Ecclesiastes in favor of passages that make us feel better. Okay, so we tend to like passages, like I said, from Psalms and from Proverbs because they like to spin things in a positive way. And people tend to ignore Ecclesiastes. They don't have verses from Ecclesiastes are not stitched on your pillow. They're not put on your refrigerator. They're not the verses that you typically recite in your mind for motivation each and every day. But it is a part of the canon, and I do think that we need to acknowledge that it's there and not just push it aside because it doesn't make us feel good. Because I think the author is trying to be honest about the fact that life is difficult, life doesn't make sense, and sometimes bad things happen to good people, and it's unfair, and he's just being honest. But that's because we live in a broken world, which of course is going to be fixed on the day of judgment when God decides to bring every act into judgment. So I'm going to conclude here with an interesting passage that I think is very familiar. This is probably the most familiar passage for people in Ecclesiastes, but I'm going to suggest something to you, and I want you to see if this makes sense. Okay? There's an appointed time for everything. This is really interesting because when the leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, said that, hey, it's time for us to go to war, he actually quoted this passage. He says, look, there's a time for war and time for peace. Right now, it is a time for war. Okay? Now, what we have in this passage, and again, I just kind of broke them off to where you can kind of see how it works. It gives two things, like a time for birth, time to die, time to plant, time to uproot, time to kill, and a time to heal. I'm actually going to make this suggestion to you, and this is not original to me. I actually read this in a bunch of commentaries, that it gives you two things here, and one of them is preferable and good, and the other one is not to be preferred and bad. And you have to decide which one is the good one to be preferred and which one is not to be preferred. I don't think it's generally saying that, well, sometimes it's okay for you to do good things and sometimes it's okay for bad things. I think it's acknowledging that, you know what, in this world, sometimes good things happen, sometimes bad things happen, but there clearly is a good thing in the midst of these choices. So let's just kind of go through them and I'll just kind of give you my take on it. Okay. A time to give birth and a time to die. Clearly, a time to give birth is far more favorable, and a time to die is not good. A time to plant and a time to uproot. Well, clearly, planting is way better than being uprooted. A time to kill and a time to heal. Clearly, a time to heal is better than killing. Okay. Time to tear down and time to build up. Well, I think building people up or building up a building or whatever it may be, building up a community or a family or someone who's struggling, that's always better than tearing someone down. A time to weep and a time to laugh. Well, if you're weeping in sorrow, that's not good. You would prefer to laugh, wouldn't you? Okay. Time to mourn and a time to dance. Clearly, again, you would prefer to dance than mourn. Time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. Well, obviously, gathering stones is much more preferable than throwing stones. Why would you throw stones? If you're angry at somebody or if someone needs to be stoned under, the law of Moses, that's not a good thing. Time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. I mean, when is it ever good to shun embracing? It's just, obviously a time to embrace is always better. Time to search and a time to give up as lost. Well, I think obviously searching implies you have hope of something. Giving up is never good. A time to keep and a time to throw away. I think obviously keeping things is better than throwing things away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. Sewing together obviously seems to be better. Time to be silent and time to speak. Okay. This one's, you might say, well, there's some wisdom in this, but I think obviously speaking, like speaking the gospel, is always preferable than being silent. Time to love and a time to hate. Obviously, love is, from a Christian perspective, more important than hating. And a time for war and a time for peace. Clearly, a time for peace is to be preferred than a time of war. So I think in this passage, when you read all of them together and you think, what is this trying to get you to do? It's not just saying you've got two options in kind of this general sense of the way the world works. I think it's saying there are two options and you should be living in one of these ways and not the other way. Like there's a right path and the wrong path. You should obviously choose the right path. And when you look at them, which one is better than the other seems fairly obvious. So I would encourage you, if you're reading this, to say, okay, I should be doing one of these and not the other one. So, I mean, maybe you want to circle the one that you think is right in your Bible or underline it, whatever it may be, whatever you want to do. I think that's a good idea to do with this particular passage. Which, again, I think this is the most commonly thought of passage when people think about Ecclesiastes. But I don't think people have taken the time to stop and to think, what is it actually trying to do? What is it trying to encourage the readers to actually do and to think about? So, okay, so that is what I have for wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Again, we're just kind of scratching the surface, but hopefully that gives us enough to have some guidelines and some strategies on how to read them in a way that we can get the most out of these books that I think we might not have had if we're just kind of just jumping in and starting in chapter 1, verse 1, and just reading it through um, without any light at the end of the tunnel. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and we will see you next time. We'll start talking about how to read the Gospels. So take care and good luck with your reading.